Hey everybody, how's it going? Kuroda, Rob here. Welcome back to Sunday Album Reviews. I want to start this off really quick by just saying that I did receive a request last week, which I'm going to do for next week's review. The reason for that being is that it's an album that I've never heard of, and the person who requested, I'm sure, will watch this. Um, and I guess everybody might as well know it was James. Requested me to review an album, and I have listened to it. I just don't feel like I've listened to it enough since it's an album I've never heard before, and I want to make sure I give it like a proper, amount of time before I actually review it. So I intend to review it next week. So I won't spoil what the album is, but James, you know what it is, and I've listened to it a couple times, but I don't feel like it's a sufficient amount of time to make for a proper review. So I will have that next week, but. I figured, regardless, one thing that James said was he wanted me to review an album from. I can't remember what his exact words were. Actually, it was like from like a more modern era album anyway. And this album is still 17 years old, which is pretty old, but it was made at the turn of the new millennium here, and it's also an album that I really really love and. Definitely newer anyway than any of the other albums I've reviewed. And it's also a metal album. And I was thinking, well, I've done 3 progressive rock albums, so maybe it's time to change genres a little bit. So I thought, why not heavy metal? I love heavy metal. So the album is, are you ready? Toxicity by System of a Down. This to me is one of the best albums in the last 20 years. I mean, top 5 albums in the last 20 years. I absolutely adore this album. And as far as a heavy metal album, I think it's one of the best heavy metal albums of all time. It's really, I think, different. It kind of pushes the boundaries of heavy metal in ways that I think only the greatest metal bands did. And I think System of a Down is probably the best, in my opinion anyway, the best metal band of the last 30 years, something like that, because from that, at least since the 80s. And I say that because I feel like that their music is very different than a lot of other metal bands. I feel like they incorporate a lot of different elements into their music. Not that other metal bands don't, but they do it in a very, I don't know, they just have a very unique sound to them, a sound that nobody else has really. I mean, and it incorporates many different styles. I mean, you have various sorts of like sounding metal. Like, there's obviously a thrash element. There's kind of an alternative sound, kind of industrial, kind of I guess what else is classified as is new metal. Some very very heavy stuff, but they also incorporate elements of, I would say like progressive elements, sometimes folk elements. They have lovely melodies, which is something that like particularly vocal melodies, which is something, and harmonies as well. I think Serj Tankian and Darren Malakian, that's his name. It's hard to pronounce their names. They're all the whole band are all Armenian, and they have very hard to pronounce last names. But Darren Malakian, the guitar player, and of course Serj Tankian, the frontman, who also plays a little bit of piano and keyboards occasionally. They have some wonderful vocal harmonies in their music, and often, especially in this album too, often evoking a Beatles-esque sound to some of their melodies. I really think anyway. You could definitely tell there was a Beatles influence there. But I just feel like they really push the boundaries of metal. They're also very, for some reason, very very commercially successful. This album went to number 1 in 2001, which is, I think, a big statement, especially considering you think of what else was around in 2001. Some of the, especially in pop music, I'm pretty sure Britney Spears was still around, and people like that. So it's kind of interesting that this group of Armenian heavy metal musicians made an album that went to #1 and had several albums that were. I have to look at the other albums, but I know were very, very commercially successful. They're probably one of the most commercially successful metal bands ever. Really, I mean, up there with Metallica and Iron Maiden and I guess Black Sabbath. Bands like that. I mean, they're really, really up there. And I think, given that Toxicity is a bit of and the band are now about 20 years old, I mean, they're now considered classic. I mean, just they're a classic kind of band, very very respected. They're seen as having quite a history, but I think for me, this album, Toxicity, is their best album by far. They have all their albums are really good. It's debatable. I know a lot of people love their first album. As far as commercially, probably Mesmerize might be at least on par or perhaps surpasses this album in success. But to me, it's got to be Toxicity. It was the album that got me into System of a Down, and I was a bit of a late bloomer. I didn't really start listening to System of a Down until maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So when they came out, I remember when they came out. I remember everybody listening to them. I remember hating them, actually. It was before I got into metal, and then after I got into metal several years down, it even took a little while. I thought they were a little too much for me. But then once I heard this album, that's when my mind changed, I think. Because there's just something about this album, particularly in some of the tracks like Chop Suey and Toxicity and Aerials and a couple other tracks where there's such lovely, like I said, lovely melodies, lovely, like they have some really nice choruses and very catchy choruses, I guess, sometimes, mixed with some very, very archaic, odd, nuances to their music. They add all kinds of strange elements. I know they'll add little bits of Middle Eastern influence, a little jazz here. I know Serj Tankian, at least, is a very, very influenced by Frank Zappa, which, if you're familiar with his music, it's very, very weird and kind of out there, but also very structured and very complex. And I think that that some of that influence goes kind of some of those odd what do I want to say, idiosyncrasies kind of come into System of a Down's music a lot, especially in this album. It's also lyrically, again, as I've said many times, not being much of a lyrics guy, it's brilliant. There's some brilliant lyrics on this album. A lot of their lyrics tend to be political, or they border they kind of have they'll kind of span the range everywhere from very deep and political, or very philosophical, even, to stupid. Some of the lyrics are just really silly, particularly on Mesmerize, I think. But this album, I don't think there's as much of that silliness as there is more kind of a very serious kind of tone to a lot of the tracks, particularly tracks like I'm just looking at the track list now. It starts out with the Prison Song, which is basically a song about the American prison system and being very critical of that. A lot of political stuff, actually. Serj Tankian writes a lot of very political lyrics. Toxicity, obviously, is about pollution and things. Basically, the toxicity of our city, obviously it's talking about, I think, has to do with pollution. And also, I think the lyrics of Toxicity as well, thinking about it, where it's like, eating seeds is a pastime activity, toxicity of our city, you, How's it go? You sitting on the world. We're I don't know. It has almost a it kind of blends the to me the idea of like yes, it's obviously talking about pollution in the environment, but I think it also talks about perhaps the toxic environment that can be created living in an oppressive kind of city in terms of like not really poverty and perhaps I think it also is sort of referencing this idea of like complacency and mediocrity of daily life and things like that. So some of the lyrics are really complex. Some of the other tracks on here, like Science, I feel like again that one's referencing the environment a little bit about like science has failed our world, science has failed our mother earth. Basically talking about how science. I interpret the lyrics anyway as how yes, science like brings upon like all of these great technological advances, but at the same time does damage to the environment, kind of thing. So I don't know. There's all kinds of really really interesting themes that they address in their lyrics. Um, I also think musically it's quite interesting. Aerials is one that I really like. It's got kind of an Eastern feel to it, and there's this like kind of hidden track at the very end of the album where there's like this kind of crazy like percussion and kind of like almost like weird like chanting going on, and from what I understand, it's kind of like some kind of Armenian traditional tune of some kind, but it's definitely adds an interesting weird way to close out the album. They tend to do weird shit like that. They'll add these kind of very strange melodies or like these really strange they'll change time signatures and like have these really weird arrangements, and it's odd because it works really well for them, and it's obviously made them hugely commercially successful, their sound, so obviously they're doing something right. But I just find it interesting because they are so successful, but they just aren't a mainstream band by any means, and they're aggressive as hell. Like their sound is very like just punching and aggressive and loud, and like it's metal. There's no question it's metal. It's not like some bands that become commercially successful that are, well, they're kind of metal. This is full on in your face, punching, just heavy metal, and it's not like, I mean, it's just to me amazing that they got as commercially successful as they did. I think also, by the way, Serj Tankian's voice is unbelievable on this album, and in general. I mean, he has such a fantastic range. And again, as I previously mentioned, his harmonies that he does with Malakian, I think are fantastic as well. I'm not a huge fan of Malakian's voice, but I think it works for System of a Down's music, and I think he harmonizes very well with Serj. And when he sings lead, I actually do kind of like it. He kind of has this like sassy whininess to his voice that I think fits their music really well. I don't think I'd like it if it was a different band. He kind of has that emo-y sort of sound to his voice, which I really don't like. No offense to you emo fans, but no, I don't like really whiny vocals like that. But it works for him for some reason in System of a Down. I don't know why. It just does. And I was just thinking about the album cover. I don't really know much about it, but I feel like looking at it, it really is. I mean, look, you guys can see it right here, but it's really an interesting and perfect album cover. Kind of has like a, well, it looks like it's supposed to be mimicking the Hollywood sign, but it almost looks like it's in a sort of dystopian kind of scene. So I always get the sense with System of a Down's lyrics that they are a bit they do kind of have a very cynical way of looking at the world sometimes. Just like the idea of like a lot of their like literally in the prison song, there's a line where I know it word for word because I love the song, but it's like drug money is used to rig elections and train brutal corporate sponsored dictators around the world. I mean, like he just goes out and just says it. And it's like a lot of bands when they sing political lyrics, they kind of allude to things, or they which I like. I like subtle lyrics when they're talking political. I don't like very precise ones, but for some reason System of a Down gets away with it to me. I don't know what it is. I think it's because they do it in a somewhat humorous way, but it's also never really in a positive way too much that I can see. Whenever they address especially like a hot subject like that, like the American prison system, or environmentalism, or corporatism, or stuff like that, they just punch you in the face with it. They don't want it to, it seems to me, they don't want it to look kind of rosy or anything like that, or be subtle. They just want to like slam the message in your face, as loud as possible and aggressively as possible, which works for them because, again, of their sound. And they really are. They're one of the heaviest bands that I think, certainly in mainstream music. I mean, without question. And they really do. They never forget that they're a heavy metal band, which is what I love about them. And I also love that they do incorporate that Armenian influence, because it's such a definition of who they are, which is really interesting. I know that's something that's very close to particularly Surge, being that, I mean, those guys are very big advocates of the Armenian genocide, of countries recognizing it, which is cool. I mean, it's neat that they do things that, I mean, I'm not like, when it comes to music, see, it's odd because, again, System of a Down is one of those bands that gets kind of a pass for me, because it's not because like I totally agree with what they're saying. It's just that, like, I don't know, it's just the way they present it is done well, whereas a lot of times like if it was a different band, I might find it a bit preachy and annoying. For some reason, to me, System of a Down gets away with it. I don't know why. And I don't think it's because I agree with everything they say. I think it's just the presentation of their music and how aggressive it is, and how, like I said, how punching it is. It's kind of like, it wouldn't make sense if the lyrics were subtle. It kind of needs to be more, bam, bam, bam. So that's my opinion of it anyway. But as a whole, I think the album flows really lovely. Lovely isn't the right word, but I think it flows really well. The musicians are amazing. The other two guys who I should mention, and I'm going to butcher their names, so please forgive me. Shavo Odadjian, I think his name is, bass player. He's got that long goatee. He's really cool. He's a fantastic bass player. Some wonderful bass lines throughout, and he really holds it together. And John Dolmayan, fantastic drummer as well. The rhythm section is unbelievable. Very, very, very tight. Can change time on a dime, which is like really, really, really. It goes to show you how good the rhythm section is in any kind of band, because the rhythm is what really holds it together. And System's music is often very fast and very aggressive, so it's like, you have to be you have to be very, very fast and very, very talented to be able to play those songs that fast, and also being able to change time like that and keeping the rhythm going. They're very, very, very good. So I don't want to like overshadow them, but often Surge kind of overshadows the whole band because he had a successful solo career, and he has a wonderful voice, and he writes, pretty sure, most if not all the lyrics. And he's great. And Darren Malakian, he is a great guitar player. He's not a soloist really so much. He's not like one for flashy solos, but I think he's a fantastic guitar player. He's probably one of the best rhythm guitar players ever. And it's not, and he also doesn't play purely rhythmically either. He does do other things, but he's subtle and also very, I don't know how to describe his playing, but it's very very good. I like it. He'll solo occasionally, but not very much. Particularly on this album, he doesn't really solo a ton, but um, it's good. My favorite song off the album. This may be a little bit excuse me. This may be a little bit cliche, but I love Chop Suey. I absolutely love Chop Suey. It's particularly the end where it's like, trust in my self-righteous suicide. I don't know. I just love the melody of that, the whole way that song just progressed, especially the end. It's a beautifully done song. There's something. It's one of my favorite songs of one of my favorite songs of theirs. Period. I just absolutely love it. I blast that in the car. I just I can't help but just sing my heart out to it because there's just something about that song that's fantastic. And there's some lovely piano in that song, which I think Serge plays, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just double check that. I'll cut this here if I need to. Okay, so I couldn't find it, but my guess is it's either Serge or Rick Rubin plays piano on the album, who produced this. And I meant to mention that before. That's a really big point that should be made here. Rick Rubin producing the record. I mean, Rick Rubin is a very very famous producer. He's worked with everybody from Johnny Cash to Lady Gaga to Metallica to Black Sabbath. I mean, he's been all over the board, and he produced this album. And I think that is worthy of mention because it's a very very well done production, and I think he really took the band to the next level on this album. Yeah, I think he did a fantastic job with it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about the album. For me, it's one of the. I would say for me, it's a modern classic. I know that's a weird, it's a stupid term that people use, but it's not like something like they're not like a band like in terms of metal like Black Sabbath or Iron Maiden or Judas Priest or any of those like classic rock, classic metal bands. But it's still a classic as of now. I mean, it is almost 20 years old now, the album, and it's certainly made a huge impact on popular culture. It's made a huge impact on heavy metal. They've been a hugely influential band. I think that System of a Down, given another 10 years too, they're going to be really, I think they are now, but I think when all is said and done, they're going to be considered real pioneers and one of the really shining moments in my opinion, an otherwise kind of shallow pool of music of that time. Unfortunately, I mean that's my opinion, at least of mainstream music. But I think that they are kind of really they really stand out, and I think the fact that they were able to achieve the success they did with the sound they had and being unique and being themselves and having influence and making a wonderful album like this, I think that says a lot. And I think to me this will always remain their all-time classic album, and I absolutely love it. So if you haven't heard Toxicity, you should. And even if you're not really a metal fan, you might like it. Rachel, for example, she's not a metal fan by any means, and she really likes System of a Down and this album. So I recommend giving it a shot. If you don't like it, you don't like it. It's not for everybody. But I will say it took me maybe one or two listens to actually start getting into it personally. And I don't think if I wasn't a metal fan, I would have gotten into it as much as I have. But the more I listen to this album and this band, the more I like them. So I highly recommend it. Check out this album if you haven't heard it before. So anyway, guys, that's that for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. It was a little different than what I was doing. I'm glad, because I don't want to just do prog rock. But I do love heavy metal. I do love lots of other genres of rock. I will say I don't listen to... I will say it's not... I shouldn't say that. I should say I will say that I do listen to mostly rock. You will get some other genres occasionally from me, but for me, I'm a big rock fan, so you can expect mostly reviews of rock albums. But I'm open to suggestions. So if anybody, again, really wants me to hear an album and review it, I'm happy to do it. Just send me one. Let me know what you want to see below. And next week, you guys can expect another new album, another newer album from actually only a couple years ago, and I'd never heard it up until last week. So once I'm done listening to it, James, I will not interview. James, I will review that album, and it should be interesting because, like I said, I hadn't heard it up until this last week. So we'll see how it goes. But I want to thank you guys again for watching and tuning into Sunday album reviews, and I'll see you guys next week. Peace. Bye, everybody.